who are part of our South Wales cluster, trying to put on events, or putting on events, west of London and even in Wales, moving outside of England, to really bring together, men and women who are interested in some of the engineering and sort of share things across disciplines. So I'll just give you a little bit of background on the Women's Engineering Society. So we had our 100-year centenary this year on the 23rd of June. Any of you who've ever heard of Women's Engineering Day, it's actually on the 23rd of June because that was the day that the Women's Engineering Society signed their articles with the aim of promoting education of women in engineering, education of the public about women in engineering, because even now, 100 years on, I get surprised when somebody asks me, what I do, and I say I'm an engineer, and also relieve poverty among women engineers. So this was founded alongside the suffragette movement when women were in the war going in and doing a lot of those jobs traditionally done by men, but maybe not getting paid the same. So we'd say 100 years later, we celebrated our anniversary in the Senate as part of the Welsh cluster this summer, and our objectives remain the same, but obviously the world has changed, but a lot of the activities, some are not needed, but there still is, I think, still a massive need to educate people and young women to understand that engineering is a career for them if they would like it. So we're a resource. Anybody can join the Women in Engineering Society. To be a member, you need to have certain engineering credentials and be a woman. But to be associate member, we take people from other disciplines and men. So, and if anybody's interested in signing up, you can speak to Kath afterwards, or Milada, they're waving. So, and we do a number of projects. I won't go through everything because that's not what tonight's about. But so we have the International Women in Engineering Day, where we try and showcase what women are doing in engineering. And also have a number of things with STEM returners, trying to get women back into STEM after they've had a leave for whatever reason, and it can be very difficult to get into that new market, get back into work when you've been in another field. Things move on incredibly quickly. It's one of the reasons why I love engineering, but it is what makes it hard if you have had a gap. A mentor set, which is pairing up mentors with other women and girls. And we have a number of events to celebrate and promote the top women in engineering. One thing I get involved with is writing Wikipedia pages, and what you find out is that there can be really incredible women. One in particular that I was quite passionate about was the woman who was the chief engineer for the second Panama Canal building. I mean, biggest civil engineering project in the whole world. And I wrote a Wikipedia page, and I was initially told she wasn't notable enough because that wasn't a big enough project to have done to deserve a place on Wikipedia. Fortunately, I stood up for myself and rectified that, but I think that just goes to show the some of the barriers we're still pushing against today. And we have a number of conferences, exhibitions, and we also are showcasing the Centenary Trail, where we're showcasing lots of women from the past and what they've done, and the fact that women aren't just suddenly joining engineering. We've been here all the time, and it's just making sure that we get our presence ignored. I'll skip over the student conference because I think it's slightly and I just want to go on to, just before I introduce our speaker, a great friend and colleague and head of design for the Active Building Centre, I just wanted to sort of talk to two of the people that I think, my daughter and her friend, who are maybe future engineers, but certainly future people will be looking at what do they want in a building. And this is quite interesting for me to ask them what they wanted. So sorry it's a bit blurry, but I'll go through what they've asked for. So they did put solar panels on there just because they know that I'm techie and I want them. But the key things that they wanted was bag racks, places to put their bags, big windowsills they can sit on when it's sunny. And insulation. Now, I was very surprised at the insulation. That did not come from me, but apparently their school is very cold and their thermostat's in the kitchen. So I think really in summary, although they said they wanted something very modern, what came out from those two girls, all right, it's not a great study, is that they just want a building that's comfortable to live in and that works. And I think that leads me into introducing Joanna, who going to stand up with me. There was a little bio on the introduction to this, but what I would like to say, what I always think is amazing about Joanna is that she took a risk about 8 years ago now, six years ago, as an architect, and took a risk to come and join the College of Engineering with a load of engineers who thought that so long as we build a building that's got these brown solar panels on and a big square battery and it's as insulated as it can be, people will want to buy that. And Joanna has taken on board the technology, but also brought in the architect's eye of doing all those things my daughter and her friend were asking for. You know, will it be livable, and will it provide what the occupants want? And she's really driven through that ethos. And as engineers, certainly myself, I've learned a lot from that. And now she's heading up, head of design of the Active Building Centre, which is looking to replicate. So this is a demonstrator building here that we're in. The other building there is slightly less of a demonstrator. And now Joanna is heading up the team that's going to make these buildings, instead of be demonstrators, will be able to be purchased and used for the general public and everybody who needs them. So without any further, I'll pass you on to Joanna.
Thank you. So as John said, I'm Joanna Clarke, so I don't need to introduce that. So just for a few things that I'm going to talk about today. Firstly, I'm just going to talk a little bit about my background, then give an introduction to what we mean by active buildings, the political context, why it's important, what we're doing, then talk about the principles, some of our case studies, and what we're doing to try and transform construction. So I started my career as an architect in a commercial practice. I worked there for 13, 14 years, and during that time I worked on some really exciting projects, wide-ranging, ranging from things like designing a new horse racing course to a dental practice, and I worked on lots of historic buildings. So really varied jobs that I worked on. But in 2013, I was just looking for a change of direction in my career and stumbled across a role that's specific, and thought, oh, that sounds interesting, you know, I'll see if I can get a position there. So I started working there in October 2013, and my role at Specific was to liaise with the construction industry and be the sort of conduit between the research and all the exciting new technologies that were being developed, and look at how those could be translated to be used on building projects, and to find suitable buildings to demonstrate them on. So as an architect, I thought, well, if we've got all these fantastic technologies, the best way of engaging with architects and contractors and clients is to actually build our own buildings. So we did that, and I'll talk about those a little bit later on. Then back in 2017, I started a professional doctorate in the sustainable built environment, and this was, my main reason for doing this was to try and create a sort of research project that captured all my architectural knowledge and the knowledge that I'd learned on renewable technologies and how to integrate them into buildings, into sort of one sort of research project. So that's still ongoing, hopefully be finished in the next few years. And then I joined the Active Building Centre back in January 2019, this year. But what do we mean by active buildings? So an active building is one that uses renewable energy technologies for heat, power and transport, and uses them to intelligently connect the building to the grid. So what we mean by that is that the building supports the energy network rather than being a burden on it, that as most buildings are. So we can do things like choose when our power is exported to the grid or taken from the grid. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. But first of all, I'm just going to set the political context, why it's important that we're doing this work. And on this slide, I'm just going to show some of the targets that the UK and Welsh Government have committed to us achieving in the next 30 years. And there's quite a lot of them. So in 2002, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive set targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 20% below 1990 levels by 2020. The EU 2020 targets added to this with targets for energy efficiency and renewable energy. And then the UK Renewable Energy Strategy was established to try and reach those targets, to find ways that we could actually reach those targets. And this was followed in 2009 by the Climate Change Strategy for Wales, which actually took those targets further and suggested we should actually aim for a 40% reduction below 1990 levels. Then in 2013, the government launched a report called Construction 2025, which set various ambitious targets for the construction industry to meet by 2025, one of them including 50% lower emissions from the built environment. And just earlier this year, there was a report called UK Housing Fit for the Future, produced by the Committee for Climate Change, and that suggested that we should have no new gas connections in houses after 2025. And this will be implemented through changes to the Part L of the building regulations and the future home standards, both of which are currently out for consultation. And then in 2018, the UK government launched their Clean Growth Challenge as part of the industrial strategy. And this said we need to halve the energy use of new buildings by 2030. And this is supported by lots of the professional bodies like the Royal Institute of British Architects, who've set challenges for energy efficiency for buildings and energy targets that buildings should reach to help us to reach that aim. Also in 2018, there was a report called The Road to Zero, and that suggested that we should have no new petrol or diesel cars and vans by 2040. So all of these things are suggesting we need to do quite a bit of work to change what we do in buildings and how buildings are operated. In 2015, the UK, among 196 other states, signed up to the Paris Agreement, and this was to limit global temperatures to well below 2 degrees, with some long-term goals for net zero emissions. And earlier this year, the Climate Change Act of 2008 was revised, so that originally it said that we would cut greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. They raised that to 100%. So it's quite an ambitious target. And then also in Wales, we have the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act. We're the only country to actually have such an act, but this is about setting wellbeing goals for Wales. And as you can see on this diagram, energy is the biggest greenhouse gas emitter in the EU. These are based on 2017 figures. It's by a long way, so it's a massive challenge for us. And the UK is actually the second biggest greenhouse gas emitter in Europe. The good news is the UK is on or has actually met the 2016 target for reducing emissions. But a report produced earlier this year states that we're actually not on target for our 2030 emissions. So we've still got a long way to go. I included this graph because it shows the big challenge that we do have. So you've seen on the previous slides that we've made statements that we're going to decarbonise the heat network, we're going to decarbonise the transport network. But as you can see on this chart, the blue lines that you see, that's our gas usage, which you can see is much bigger than our electricity usage, which is the red line. So all of those, the jaggedy lines are the peaks and troughs of our gas network, the obvious troughs in summer and peaks in winter when we all need heating in our houses. And you can see it's a huge amount more than the electricity that we need, that we use and that we actually have. So how are we going to move all of that gas into the electricity network? We need to do something differently. And that's what we're aiming to do with active buildings. So we've got 6 principles to an active building. The first 2 are all about reducing energy. So they're not anything new. I think most people are doing these sorts of things already. So they're to do with building fabric, passive design, using energy efficient systems. And that's, we talked earlier about, talked to someone about passive house principles. There's building regs stating that we must be more energy efficient. So those are the sorts of things that we have to do anyway. We then look at on-site renewable energy generation. Here we focus on solar energy, but it's not to say other renewable energy sources are applicable for other sites, things like ground source, sometimes hydro, sometimes wind, whichever source, doesn't matter. And then energy storage for both heat and electricity. And that's really critical to provide that buffer between the building and the grid to enable us to do things like time shift when we use electricity or gas or from the grid. And electric vehicle integration. So if it was light, I would have shown you outside, we've got some electric vehicle charge points. Electric vehicles can be seen as an added storage device for buildings, and also the buildings will support the amount of electricity that we need to charge the electric vehicles. And then integrating with the wider energy networks is the key to the success of these buildings. So I'll just talk you about some of the case studies. The first active building we built was back in 2014, and it was designed as a small off-grid garden office building. And the main purpose of designing this was just to sort of show the researchers at specific, but also to show people that we were working with what we meant when we talked about, at that time we called them buildings as power stations. And you could see all these technologies working together on one small building. So it's a built-in integrated PV roof, there's a glazed solar air collector, some heating inside the building, and it's completely self-sufficient. So this was quite successful in getting that idea across to people. And then in 2016, we built this building that you're in today, the active classroom. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a minute. And then in 2018, we built the building next to this building, which is called the active office. We're also involved with a housing project in Neath, which is being developed by a social housing association called Pobl. And what you'll notice is the timescale on that project, December 2015 to November 2019. That is how long that project has taken to actually come to fruition. It's almost nearing completion now. But this, I think, highlights the reason that we need these demonstrators, because these enable us to learn quickly about what works and what doesn't work. And we're in control of the timescales. On projects that we work on with partners, we're not in control of the timescales. You've got all sorts of challenges like planning or funding issues. And it takes a lot longer to get the technologies out there. So what we've been able to do on these demonstrators is see quickly how well they work together. So talking in a bit more detail about the classroom, when we built this, our purpose was to not only showcase the concept of active buildings to the public, but also to demonstrate lots of new technologies. And one of the important points about Specific is it's an industrial and academic collaboration. And one of its main purposes is to help UK companies grow. So for us, it was really important that we were able to showcase some new products that had not been used in construction before. And as you can imagine, it's very difficult for contractors or architects or even clients to take a risk on new products on a building that people are going to be using every day. But we were able to take that risk. So the roof that you see, the second picture along on the bottom, by a company called BIP Co. That was the first time that particular PV had ever been installed on a building. So we were able to try it on this building. I have to say it's worked perfectly well since we installed it. And then we then went on to install it on our second building, the active office, and it's also used on the Active Homes Neath project. And since so when we put it on this building, it didn't have any warranties or accreditation. It now does have all of those, and this sort of helped to help the company to be able to prove that it actually worked. So they now offer a joint warranty with Tata of 25 years. Tata Steel is another one of our main industrial partners. So we wanted to showcase some of their products as well. The roof you see, the PV roof, that's on Tata Calico Urban. It's a thin film. Actually, I have a sample here to show you. A thin film PV, which is just bonded onto steel roof sheets. So you can see it's very, very thin. These are the individual cells, which are strung together to make the modules, which are then bonded onto the steel roof sheets in the factory. So when your roof comes to site, it's one installation. As we put the roof on, it's ready to generate electricity. So it's a really nice system. When you see it on the roof, you can barely even tell that it's there. It's lightweight, which is another good advantage. So the building that we're in here is a lightweight construction. So we haven't had to add any extra structure to be able to support the roof. It works well in low light conditions, so even on cloudy days, it still generates something. So it's been a really nice product for us to be able to showcase. The construction of this building, I just mentioned that it's lightweight. You'll notice it's quite rough and ready. You can see all the joints in the panels. This was another new company, a new form of construction, which was these steel-framed interlocking panels. And this company had come to us through Tata's innovation portal. They said, oh, we've got this product, we want to showcase it on a building, but it's very difficult for them to get that traction in the market. So we took a risk. They'd never built a building of this size before, they'd never built a pitched roof, they'd never worked with a main contractor. So there was all sorts of issues. And when we were doing this building, we had very, very tight timescales as well. So it was a very challenging project, but very exciting and great to be able to showcase these products. The colours that we used, the coatings for cladding, they were a new product, that a new coating that Tata had developed, and it was pre-commercial when we put it on this building. So again, Tata were able to use that in their marketing material. The big batteries that you see in the middle picture, they have not been used in the UK before. They're saltwater batteries. So we like them for their environmental credentials. They're cradle to cradle certified. So we thought, yeah, let's take a risk and put them in this building. We're actually going to be replacing these soon with something called flow batteries. So this building also enables us to do that, to try lots of different technologies as we want to. And the first picture that you're seeing along there, that's a picture of a transferred solar collector. So that's collecting warm air that we can use in the building. So as you can see, it's just a sheet of cladding, metal cladding, with lots of little holes in it, perforated sheet. And what happens is when the sun shines on this, it gets hot, a boundary layer of warm air forms on the surface. There's a cavity behind this of about 100 mil, which also gets warm. And then all you have is a fan at high level that draws that warm air into the building. It's a very, very simple form of heating. It's been around for a long time, actually, and it's used a lot on industrial sheds for background space heating, because it's a nice sort of warm temperature. It doesn't get very hot temperatures. But what we're doing on this building is using it in conjunction with an air source heat pump. So it means we can use a lower powered air source heat pump. The heat pump doesn't have to work so hard because you're bringing in preheated fresh air to it. So you can see we're trying lots of different things and looking at how they work together. The little graph in the corner here, doesn't really matter what the figures are, it's just you can see the blue column, the pale blue column, is the CIBSE benchmark for a classroom or school building. And you can see that we're less than half of that in terms of energy usage. So our energy consumption is a lot lower on this building. And we generated 5.5 megawatt hours of excess electricity in 2017 to 18, which was enough to travel 26,000 miles in a Nissan Leaf. So that was nice. We're able to say our cars are powered by the sun. So then this one had been quite successful in getting us noticed in the construction industry. It got people's interest. People were saying, can we have one of those buildings? But there were so many new products in this building that we couldn't really replicate it. So Innovate UK, who are one of our main funders, they gave us some money to build a second building, and for this they said it must be repeatable, it should use commercially available, albeit innovative technologies, and it's something that can be taken to market. So we worked on this one with a local modular build company called Wernick. Worked with them right from the start of the design, which is really critical because we could design the building to their module sizes. And also we had another very challenging timescale on this building. So we were awarded the money at the end of October 2017. They said the money has to be spent by March 2018. And at that point, we hadn't even started thinking about a building, let alone designing. So between the end of October and Christmas, we managed to design the building, get planning permission, get a main contractor on board so that they could start on site in January. It does highlight the benefits of using off-site construction because our construction site was just a muddy, wet mess in January, but meanwhile the office was being manufactured in a factory. So within the first month, we had a weather-tight building on site. It was then clad and fitted out over the next few months, and we actually finished it in June 2018. The newest technology on this one was the tubes, which you can see on the second picture, and they're combined solar thermal and PV. And they were manufactured by a company called Naked Energy, who are a UK company, and they'd only ever made 5 of these tubes that they'd installed on a flat roof. So they'd never installed them on a vertical elevation or actually produced this many of the tubes. We've got 40 tubes on the elevation. So they were really pleased to work with us so that they had somewhere to showcase their new product, and they've had a lot of interest in the product since. I actually think it's really nice use of space on the south elevation where you're often space constrained, fighting with wanting to put technologies on and wanting windows for light. So it's a really nice technology, and again, it's been working pretty well. So what you can see, it's just slightly covered in the corner, is a display screen showing what our energy is doing at any one time. So we've got a real-time screen in the office. This was actually taken in June, earlier this year. And we can see what we're generating at any one time, where that energy is going, how full the batteries are, how full the thermal store is, and where the loads are going. So you'll notice in the circle, in the pie chart, a lot of green. That's car charging. So we always notice in the building when you plug a car in, that's the majority of the energy. But what storing electricity and thermal energy enables us to do is time shift demand in terms of the grid seeing it. So, for example, if we put 10 kilowatts of heating into this room, the grid wouldn't know that because it's coming from the batteries. So we're able to choose when we charge up the batteries. So in the office, we can charge up the thermal store overnight. So you will see in this graph, the yellow that you can see is when we're charging, and it's too small to read, I think, but that's overnight. So that's between the hours of 11 at night and 7 in the morning. So we can charge up the batteries then, so that in the day then we're not actually taking anything from the grid. In fact, we're normally exporting something, as we are in that diagram. And what we can do is choose when we export to the grid. So the university is on a higher tariff between 5 and 7:30, so we can choose to dump a load of electricity into the grid at that time of day, saving electricity money, but also taking some pressure off the grid, which is one of the really important parts of what we're doing. And we've just had a report which showed the report did a comparison of the active office with a traditionally built building of the same size over a 6-year period, and found we had 3.5 times lower carbon emissions. So that's really nice to know. And you can see a similar graph here. We're actually more like a third of the CIBSE benchmark for an office building in terms of energy use. One thing we're doing on this building, which has taken it a step further from the classroom, is we're collecting a lot of data from both buildings, but on the office we're able to do things that I've started to describe in terms of optimizing the controls. Ultimately, we hope to move to predictive controls so that the system can look at, the weather forecast for the next day and then decide what to do about the batteries, or it can look at calendars to decide, does your car need power? When does your car next need power? Maybe it's not till the following morning, so it will charge overnight rather than when you've just plugged it in when there's a heavier demand on the grid. So all sorts of things like that. And we can display the data in different ways. So this shows the cutaways through the plant room. The large rectangle you see is the thermal store, which we try and keep around 40 degrees. That can be charged in different ways. So ideally we'll be charging it from the solar thermal tubes. That will only happen if they can get a high enough temperature. So on a cloudy, wet day, you're not going to be charging from the tubes. So then we've got a dual stage air source heat pump which kicks in, and that can be used to charge up the tank. But as I said, that doesn't have to be during the day. That could be done overnight. And then we can see floor plans of the space to see what temperatures we've got. We're trying to maintain a temperature of 21 degrees in all the spaces, and you can see on this diagram we are actually managing that through the controls. This is the housing project that I talked about. So this is called Active Homes Neath. It's 16 dwellings, 8 flats and 8 houses, a mixture of 2 and 3 bed. And they started construction last June. It was due to finish this August, but they've had a few delays and it's nearing completion now. So it should be finished the end of this month. And this, I think, is going to be really interesting because we're going to have social housing tenants living in these buildings, maybe people who don't normally think about where their energy comes from. It'll be quite interesting to see, if they use their energy differently, how much interest they actually take in it. So we've got a government study with Bays, which will be running for a year of occupancy. They'll be monitoring in the houses so we can actually see the real data, but also they'll be interviewing the tenants to see how they like the houses. I visited the site yesterday, and they're really nice houses to be in, and you wouldn't really know that they were anything different other than the fact that, because they've got the solar collectors, transparent solar collectors on the walls, their heating is through, it's air heating rather than radiators, rather than a wet system. So that's the only real difference I think they would notice. We're lovely and warm, built to a high standard of thermal efficiency, and they've got the PV on the roof, which you can just about see there, and they've all got individual batteries as well. So I think this is going to be an interesting project over the next year to see how it performs. So now I'll just move on to talk a little bit more about the Active Building Centre and what how we're funded and what we're funded to do. So you can't see that, sorry, it's just covered up a little bit. But that just says UK Government Industrial Strategy. That was established in May 2018. And it was established to boost productivity in the UK by backing businesses to create jobs and increase earning power of people throughout the UK. So there was a large investment in skills, industries and infrastructure and they set up an Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund of £4.7 billion, which was investment in R&D to be spent over the next 4 years to support the delivery of the programme. And under that, they identified 4 grand challenges. There was artificial intelligence and data, an ageing society, clean growth, and the future of mobility. We're funded under Transforming Construction, which is part of the Clean Growth Strategy, alongside something called Prospering from the Energy Revolution. And this funding is split in 3 ways. The Active Building Centre, we had £36 million of funding to spend over the next 3 years. Construction Innovation Hub, which is a combination of the Building Research Establishment, the BRE, the Manufacturing Technology Centre in Coventry, and the Centre for Digitally Built Britain. So that's very much focused on digitising construction, on off-site construction, modern methods of construction, all of that sort of thing. And then there's other research and development projects. So they just closed their second call for funding for people to bid in. So people could bid in and say, I'm building this factory, I want to make it an active building, and they could bid for money to do that. And then they will work with us to support those projects. So the funding is just closed, but the assessment hasn't finished yet of those projects. But the Active Building Centre was really set out from these demonstrator buildings and the work that Specific is doing. I think Specific was going maybe a bit further than it wanted to into the construction world. So it got to the stage where we really needed a new entity to take it forward. So the vision for the Active Building Centre is to transform both the UK construction and energy market. So I think that's the key point about what we're doing, is it does actually affect both industries. And that is really challenging because not only is the construction industry extremely resistant to change, so is the energy industry. So trying to do them both at the same time isn't easy, but I think it's necessary if we're going to do anything about the targets that I showed you earlier. So what are we doing to actually enable the construction industry? Because that's what we've said we'll do. We'll enable the construction industry to adopt the active building concept. And how do you do that? So one of the ways is you get the word out there, you spread knowledge about what we're doing. So you can do that through contributing to magazine articles, journal articles, and things like the Royal Institute of British Architects journal, which is well read within the profession. Speaking at events, so the picture on that side is our head of engagement talking at UK Construction Week in Birmingham back in October, and there I am speaking at Grand Design Live, and also entering for awards, because that gives us credibility within the industry as well as getting us noticed. And when we attend those awards, we find then people come to us and say, "Oh, can you help us on this building? We'd like to use the concept on our buildings." So it's a really great way of actually getting us noticed. And then one of the things I'm doing through my doctorate, but it's actually also going to be one of the first sort of publications from the Active Building Centre, is developing a design guide so that we can give this to architects. This is how you would design an active building. So it's structured around, the main section is really part 2, which is structured around the 6 principles of an active building. But we're also going to talk in there about whole life carbon, the business case for active buildings, life cycle assessments, all of that sort of thing. And also it's somewhere where we can put case studies of buildings that we've actually done as well. So I'll just talk through some of the key principles in a little bit more detail. So the first one is building fabric and passive design. And the sorts of considerations we mean here is things like orientation of the building, utilising biodiversity in your project, the layout, the form factors. So, a rectangular space is going to be easier to make energy efficient than something that's maybe star-shaped. It's looking at those sorts of things. Use of passive natural ventilation and natural daylight as much as possible, passive cooling techniques, water, so several aspects to water, not only saving water, but actually, really importantly, especially at the moment, reducing flood risk. We've all seen flood risk out, the flooding that's going on at the moment, and a lot of that is down to a lot of the hard surfaces that we've got in the built environment. So it's more about greening up the built environment. Wales has actually introduced into their building regs, I think it was last year, that it's essential that all new building projects have sustainable urban drainage systems, or SUDs they're called. So that means that if you were paving an area, it would be permeable paving. You try and reduce the amount of hard surfaces that are impermeable. And also I think that brings into the biodiversity comes into that as well, actually planting up spaces. So there's some moves towards, at the moment, leaving, if you're building on a site, leaving it greener, or at least as green as you found it when you started. So you can do that through things like green roofs and living walls, and actually just landscaping around the building. And then the building fabrics. So looking at the carbon, the embodied carbon of materials, that's becoming more and more important now. We're actually managing to reduce the operational carbon of buildings through using things like renewable energy technologies, and also reducing the energy demand in buildings. But actually the embodied carbon in what you're building is now, the proportion of that in your building is becoming higher. And if we're trying to get to net zero by 2050, that's something we all need to think about a lot more. Getting the fabric right, so thermally efficient envelope and as airtight as possible. Window design in terms of not just the sort of glazing that you use, but the size of windows, where you're placing the windows, on which elevations. You get different performances. Indoor air quality, that's really important, and obviously thermal comfort for occupants in buildings and acoustics. So I'm just going to show you some of the things that will be included in the design guide. So there'll be diagrams to help people. They might be quite simple to people, but they might actually just act as reminders for people to think about some of these things in projects. Using real examples, good examples of passive design. In this picture, you're seeing things like, this was designed obviously in a sunny climate, so using things like recessed balconies, deep roof overhangs, shutters to keep the heat out from the sun, retractable awnings, just building that into designs. And I think in modern architecture, a lot of these things have been forgotten about. One of my biggest bugbears is things like this, which is fully glazed facades. And if you walk around London, my new hobby seems to be taking pictures of these facades everywhere. You see these fully glazed facades with all the blinds down on a sunny day, which means all the lights are on inside. And you don't need that much glass in an office. You need enough for natural light. But actually, all you end up seeing is the mess that people have under their desks, which you can see in this photo when you zoom in. And this, the blinds all down at different heights. And I don't think that's probably how the architect envisaged the building to be when they designed it, but it's just not thinking about these things. This one says energy efficient systems. So with the move to decarbonising the heat network, we're going to be looking at low carbon heat networks, so district heating, use of electric heating, either direct heating or things like heat pumps, and they can be either air source, ground source, even water source heat pumps. Use of mechanical ventilation, but only when you need it. Are there better ways to cool than just pumping air conditioning into spaces? Use of energy efficient lighting. And actually, what's really important is making sure that these different systems work together rather than against each other, which often happens in buildings. So interestingly, both parts of the building regs that are being revised at the moment are Part L, which is energy efficiency, and Part F, which is ventilation. And they're the two, I would say, that often do conflict when you're designing buildings. So it's quite nice to actually see them being thought about together. This is just a diagram of the systems working together at the active office. So it shows really that you're using the best of all the technologies. So you're using the PVT tubes, they're generating electricity to go into the batteries, but also heat to go into the thermal store. The batteries can power the air source heat pump or the immersion heater to provide the hot water. So it's just thinking about how all these systems work together. We actually, in the active office, we hadn't put in any air conditioning, and we noticed our comms cupboard was getting up to about 30 degrees. It could get really, really hot in there. So rather than putting in air conditioning, which is the usual thing that happens in offices, we actually just extended the ductwork into our MVHR system, our heat recovery system, so that we could actually draw that heat out and make use of it in the building, rather than actually pumping cooler into it, which often happens. And then renewable energy generation. So this slide is looking at electrical. So I'll have things like, the different sorts of design considerations that you need to think if you're using solar energy. So things like orientation, shading, making sure your facades that you think are going to be generating electricity are not shaded, what sort of available surface area you have. It's easier to, on a building of this size, which is single story, we've got a large roof area, we can then perhaps generate more energy than we need, but the higher you go in buildings, the more difficult that is on a roof only. So if you can use facades as well, or different technologies, then that's a benefit. Whether you have any planning constraints, so the roof that we showed here, for example, that can be, that's very low profile. We've had people come to us as well, they may be just developing a changing rooms at the bottom of a pitch of sports pitches, and they say, well, we can't put PV on them because of the fear of vandalism, but they're quite interested then in putting something like this on because there wouldn't be any opportunity to vandalise. So all these different things you can think about when selecting technologies. So that's just another image of our PV roof and the PV window that we've got in this building. So NSG, which is Nippon sheet glass or Pilkington glass, they've developed a prototype PV window which we retrofitted into this building, and we're testing that for them. But when I showed you the picture of all those fully glazed facades, if you could have something like this on the facade that's actually doing something useful, that could be a potential solution. And then also just looking at what systems you need. If you're using PV, what do you need to go with that? So if you're using PV and batteries, what's in between those different elements? And then this, just looking at different types of solar thermal collectors. So there are a number of different types. We're actually testing some of these on a test rig that we've got on an industrial building in Margam, where we've got a test rig, which is, so we're going to be able to properly evaluate these different systems and see how effective they are when working alongside each other. That's just a close-up picture of the transpired solar collector and the combined solar thermal and PV system. And again, looking at what you need when you're using these. So ideally, if you're using solar thermal, you will use a thermal store as well, because then you get the most out of your system. And then different types of electrical storage. So we've got the salt water or aqueous hybrid ion that we have in this building. Lithium ion is the type that you'll see most used in buildings at the moment. The one you're seeing here is a home energy storage. So Tesla, or this one's Sonnen Energy, they do quite nice looking batteries that you wouldn't mind having in your house. And then the flow batteries, which we're going to be installing in this building, hopefully later this year. Is that right, Tom?
Yeah, January.
Yeah, oh, January, okay. And then thermal storage. So there are different types of thermal storage. Sensible, which is normally water. So this is a picture of our 2,000 litre water tank that we've got in the office. It's a very well insulated tank, but water tends to, as you all know, lose energy over time. So that's short-term storage. Medium is something like a phase change material, which we call latent storage. So phase change materials in buildings can be embedded into ceiling tiles or the walls of buildings to almost mimic thermal mass for a building. So you can imagine they're absorbing the heat. So if we had phase change materials in this room, they would absorb all the heat so that they try and regulate the temperature in the room, maintaining that comfortable temperature so it doesn't get too hot in here. And then when we all leave, we can open some vents and discharge that energy so that it's ready to be charged up the following day. So there are some companies who actually, I think Armstrong ceilings had them that they embed into their ceiling tiles. And then you've got something called thermochemical storage, which is for longer term. So there's a group at Specific who are working on this technology, which I think is really exciting and quite game-changing for the industry. So this is a matrix of basically a vermiculite, which you can see in the picture there, with salts added to it, which is a lot denser than water, and it doesn't change phase and it doesn't lose heat. So it's an endothermic reaction that absorbs the heat into the salt solution. So when you are generating heat in the summer months for one of your solar collectors, you can transfer that into this material. It will store that heat indefinitely until you pass cool, damp air over it. So you can store heat now from summer to winter. You could also use it to capture waste heat from industrial processes and then maybe use that where it is needed, perhaps in housing or other areas. So I think that's a really exciting technology, which I think we're hoping to have a prototype installed in this building probably early next year.
Yeah.
Looking at Tom. And then electric vehicle integration. So this is a statement from the Road to Zero. which says our mission is to put the UK at the forefront of design and manufacturing of zero-emission vehicles, and for all new cars and vans to be zero emissions by 2040, which is challenging in itself, but then that opens up new opportunities for buildings. So you've got different types of electric vehicles and different types of charging that's needed. So for electric cars and motorbikes, you can either have charging spaces adjacent to the building in a car park environment. You could also have PV parking canopies over them, which not only would protect the cars, but also you could use that power to charge them. And there are roadside chargers for use when street parking is the only option. So I've seen a lot of them in places like London. Also, you've got e-bikes, so we've got a few e-bikes here. And we're looking at developing a bespoke e-bike charging shed, which would have PV on the roof, and it would be enough, hopefully generate enough power that it would be able to charge up your battery in the bike when you're at work, maybe charge up your light so that you can go home safely. And that's something that we're looking to build in our facility in Baglan, hopefully soon as well. And then you've got e-buses. So schools are becoming more interested in using e-buses because they do relatively short distances. Some of the airports use them, Schiphol use them, and actually the batteries that they use in the buses are the batteries that we've got in the active office. And then you've got things like electric scooters, which do have their place and perhaps only need smaller power requirements. And then this just shows that word under the box says microgrid flexibility. It shows what we can do with our energy and what I talked about the different value. So we can either consume the energy between our buildings, and that's saving us something like 9 pence a kilowatt hour, or we can export to the grid at 5 pence per kilowatt hour. We can choose to export it at a certain time of day. So for us, the university has an embedded network. So if we export to our neighbouring buildings between 5 and 7:30, we're saving the university 15 pence per kilowatt hour. Or you can export to electric vehicles, and then you're displacing the cost of fuel, which is around 35 pence per kilowatt hour. So what we're able to do with these buildings is to choose when we export in relation to these things. And we can also choose, perhaps something we're looking at now, is whether we can choose to export depending on the carbon intensity of the grid at any one time. So sometimes the electricity grid is, you may have seen some headlines this year where most of our electricity is coming from renewables on some days. So then maybe you don't want to export, but then other times when we'd be using coal or gas, then we want to export. So we can choose based on those. And so the sort of predictive controls that we talked about can link up to those sorts of systems. So that's just to say we're moving from a traditional one-way system where the energy is all coming from a central power generation to a more flexible system, which I think is needed if we're able to meet the targets that we're set out to. And then this is just to say that there is a lot of work that we've got to do over the next 3 years to enable change. So we're developing things like performance specifications, ways to model these buildings and new sorts of tools, more active building demonstrators. So we've committed to develop with partners 20 demonstrator buildings by February 2022 when our current funding comes to an end. Those are all new builds at the moment, and we're looking at different building types. So we're working with people on potential school projects, residential, industrial, and commercial buildings. And yeah, my only fear with them is the timescales are not always in our control, as I mentioned earlier. So that's quite a tricky thing, because actually we want to get into these projects as early as possible in the design stage so that we can influence some of the things that I talked about, like site orientation and the actual form of buildings. Whereas actually if we want buildings to be complete in this time, maybe they're going to be the more advanced buildings that we need to work with. So there's some challenges around that. And I haven't really mentioned retrofit, but that's one of the other major challenges that we have coming up. And I think that's going to become a lot higher on the agenda quite soon. So we're also developing a database of all the active building data that we're collecting. So we collect a lot of data from these 2 buildings. So any partners that we work with on projects going forward, one of the key things is that we need to be capturing data so that we can get that evidence, which will help with building performance evaluation. And that then can help with things like optimizing the systems, fault finding, developing predictive control strategies. So it's really important to capture that data, but to actually do something with it as well. Whole life costing, so we're working on that at the moment, trying to prove the business case. So at the moment, you might expect there to be an uplift on buildings if you're including all these technologies. But actually, if you look at them over a whole life cost of the building, we're hoping to be able to prove that they actually save money in the long term. But that is a challenge in itself, because most building projects tend to have a capital budget for building the building, and a different budget for the operation of the building. And that needs to change as well. So that's another different way of thinking that needs to happen, because it's not how things happen at the moment in buildings. And then the life cycle assessments to assess the carbon, not just the operational carbon, which we're able to prove at the moment, but also the embodied carbon, which is a lot more difficult to prove in buildings. And crucially, I think, is the education, skills and training at all levels. So I think we have so many issues in the construction industry at the moment. We don't attract enough people into construction or engineering in the first place. And then when we do, there's not sort of keeping training, so people don't necessarily keep up to date with all the latest things. And there's also a lot of inertia in construction. People don't, once they're used to, they've got a way of working, they don't actually want to change. So I think that's another massive challenge for us, actually. So one of the things that we're looking at is working with partner projects on how we can develop training courses for installers. I think one of the biggest issues we have in buildings, which we're experiencing in our own buildings, and you're probably all aware, is the installation and commissioning of systems. And just the fact that is often it's not right. It never actually gets to be right when struggling with our own buildings. And I think part of that is because people don't really understand the bigger picture. They don't understand how important it is to install correctly and to commission properly. So I think there's a lot more to do around that. And then the policy and regulatory changes, which is more long-term, I would say, because that's quite difficult to change as well. But at the Active Buildings Centre, we've actually got some people who are pretty much always in London, speaking to the right people who are writing policies and new regulations and trying to influence them. And that's me done, really. That's all I've got to say. So it's just, whether anybody's got any questions or wants me to elaborate on anything further. Not sure how I'm doing time-wise.
No, thank you.
And my voice got out.
Yeah, well done. If I can start, so because we've got the online link as well, we've had a few questions from online, which I will just go through, if that's all right, Jo. Yeah, so let me get back to, one question from Matt Brooks. He sent a couple. I'm going to paraphrase some of them. So what are your immediate objectives and priorities for 2020?
That's a good one. I think it's more, the objective for 2020 is really to get more projects going with partners. So we've got a long list of leads and opportunities for projects, but now we need to turn them into real projects. So I think that's one of the main priorities. And also trying to get some information out to people. So the design guide I talked about, it's not ready to be issued to people just yet, but elements of it are, and putting together some information that we can give to people, share with people, I think is probably one of the other priorities. And also working on a bit of a skills roadmap.
Yeah, so that feeds into quite a few of the questions. So Matt's follow-up question was, how can industry engage with ABC without waiting to see you at an event? Is that, do we point up here and say, just
please get in touch.
Tweet or send Joanna an email, I think, and that applies to the people in the room as well, although you can actually catch her afterwards.
Yeah, but yeah, we're always open to people contacting us, and we always will get back to people. So if people do have particular projects, then we're really happy to talk to people. We're happy showing people around our buildings and sharing any information that we have. So yeah, that's
excellent.
Good
So
first way.
Yeah, then there was. Oh, will we be sharing the recording or slides?
I don't see why not.
Yes.
So yeah.
We can do that. Number of technologies not considered here. Solar furnace. So I think if people have ideas, we always sort of will take on board if people are working on technology projects that they think this is something we should be considering. And I've had a couple of people message me about different ones, from solar furnaces to phase change materials more actively than the ones we were talking about. So I think that's all of interest. And then somebody, Alan Dean, has asked, would we want more schools looking at our work, and would retrofit projects help schools link students to their own communities? And I think
I'd say yes.
That's
both those things.
Yeah, I mean, we're based on Swansea University here, and we do engage a lot. You know, our role, as well as doing all of this, is educating people. And so we do engage a lot with schools, not just the active building centre, but I can see there's STEM ambassadors and people who go out into schools in the audience here.
That's really important.
Yeah, so if online there's anybody who wants us to engage with schools, email me probably for that one. If it's for the industry in the active building centre, message Joanna.
But I'm always happy working with schools as well, and I didn't focus on it in this presentation, but we worked with school children to plant up our living walls,
which is just on the other side of here, and you can see it if you want to go outside in the rain. It's all planted by local Swansea school children.
And also we've had groups of school children come in here, and we've done things like made solar windmills with them, so they can see how it actually works. And we're always open to that. I'm a STEM ambassador as well, so happy to go into schools or have school children here.
Excellent. So any real life questions?
Not that those are real life.
I'm an installer, one of those people that you're after. We do offer a number of the technologies that you've talked about, but I'm quite interested. Hardly mentioned MVHR. Mechanical ventilation heat recovery. You just mentioned it towards the end. And I'm looking here, there's obviously something here, but certainly in one of the studies I've done, the recent building that we've been working on, we've saved 40% of energy by having an MVHR system installed in the property.
I didn't focus on it, but in both buildings we have MVHR and also in the housing project. So it does. I think I touched on it when I talked about the office and it's connected to the comms cupboard. But we so the MVHR in this room is also connected to our transpired solar collector. So we're using that warm air as well as the warm air in here to supply air to the kitchen and the toilets where we don't have heating. But in the office building, we're using MVHR as well. So I'm sorry I didn't really focus on that, but it's a really important part of it.
It's incredible. And talk about airtight buildings, and everybody's going around doing airtight testers. And people are refusing. This is the public. Once the house built or the building built, are forgetting that they think, oh, well, we're just looking windows. You've got a huge education program to help.
Is this retrofit for this scenario or new build? This is new build. I mean, retrofit is even harder. So that's, and we don't work on retrofit, but our partner with Cardiff University are one of the partners in the specific project. They work on that side.
We have a work package on retrofit, which is going to come after we've done the new build. But I'd say with the windows as well, though, I do think people like opening windows, and I don't think they should be discouraged from opening windows as well as using MVHR. I think it's good to have the mix, which we do tend to have in our buildings, because there's misnomers about passive house that you can't open windows, but you can. It just affects the performance of the MVHR, but that's fine if you want to bring in your own fresh air. The MVHR just ensures that you'll always have that controlled ventilation level that you need. But you can do that yourself if you want as well. And I am an advocate for opening windows if you want to. But although there are some areas, where you've got external pollution where that might not be.
I think my thing is about, you're talking about renewables and that sort of thing, and it's the energy that you saved. That 40% to me was, the house would have been 5 kilowatt heat loss, and it was dropped to like a 3 kilowatt heat loss.
Wow, yeah.
So just by having NVH.
I think, maybe we can talk a bit on the education side, what we can, because you're getting first hand, we sort of get the feeling of, well, we know that people don't always know this, and it's very hard when you work, obviously in offices full of, millions of engineers, and it's very hard to get an understanding of what people are thinking when they're having a new build like that. So if there's things that we can work with on the education,
definitely.
Because that is, the other half of our job. So more than half in some days. Yeah, there was another question.
Residential buildings in Neath, what are the walls like? Are they like a classroom?
No, we've used 6 panels in the walls, but actually they're plastered, so it just looks, they look like just normal walls. But they're SIPs, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with that, it's normally OSB board, sandwich in insulation in between, so they're manufactured off-site, brought to site and like timber frame. But they look like normal, and all the surfaces aren't exposed as they are here. So you've got ceilings, and you just see a small vent in the ceiling.
For residential houses, is it going to be more expensive to buy like an active house?
It's a good question, and it's really, I guess, one for the developers. So we've only to date worked with Social Housing Association, and their main goal for doing this is to reduce fuel poverty for their tenants. But I would have thought perhaps there would be an increase. So we found that social housing associations are more open to the active building concept than the big house builders, because at the moment they just want to build as quickly and cheaply as possible.
So there's no incentive at the moment?
No. We're lucky in Wales that we've got the Welsh Government Innovative Housing Programme, and that's been able to fund the uplift that we've needed for the technologies and the monitoring of these buildings. But at the moment, some of the technologies that are so new are more expensive. So I would have thought that would probably be passed on to the person buying the house.
Just one question. The panels that you have, what is the life expectancy on in terms of before they start to deteriorate? The solar result?
The transferred solar collector, I believe we've got someone from Target here. That's the PVs are 25-year warranty.
25 years, because after obviously they do degrade over time, like electron tunneling and things. So and what would be do you have an idea of the cost of replacement?
Well, the thing with that is, because it's quite a new technology, we don't have that 25 years, so it's warranty for that. But I think what would happen at the moment is if one of the panels failed, they would just stick another one on top. But it's a joint warranty with Tata of 25 years, so it would be replaced within that time.
And is there like a projected estimate on the decline in energy production? Again, obviously, it's only.
I would have thought there probably is. I would have to check with BIPV Co, because I would have thought they'd done some work on that. But I don't have that information to hand.
The warranty isn't after 25 years, it will be not generating any electricity. And we found this with silicon. 6 is also a very stable technology. That's what the sort of PV these panels are. Also, what has been seen, and we're trying to just play with the data now, we've got a huge amount of data, and Grounding is one of the people just in front of you who's started work in September and been given a load of data. But one thing that we're trying to look at is how these buildings are working in the conditions. So when you test solar, you test it under 1 sun conditions, which is a bright light that is never seen in South Wales, and a set temperature. And there is literature that says actually the 6 panels perform much better in lower light and diffuse light. which is very hard to model or predict from lab testing. So we're looking at that as well. And at the moment, we're getting actually better performance than the stats say we should, which is sort of expected because the stats are based on sort of very conservative measurements. But that is part of the experiment. And the work
so it's the other thing these buildings allow us to do is actually test these things properly.
Well, it's like the difference between monos and polys. You know, it's like polys would behave there in level lighting. You know, if you had a hot climate, monos the way to go. Sorry,
Any other questions? No? Then I will thank you.